Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFT, Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. And today is Sunday, October 28th, 2018, a couple of days before Halloween. And this is the Prairie Monk program, WEFT's weekly look at rails, trails, greenways, conservation, and everything that Dave's been up to in the last week.
Well, last week we talked about irrigation. I didn't conclude that effort. It looked like it was all straightforward, but it was not. I want to look at the irrigation experiment in Australia and in the US as an example of how you go about changing things. We have a prairie that's almost extinct in the sense of having an area of 100 species, an area large enough to represent what was here at settlement time. And some of the things that happened with this sort of irrigation project have parallels. One of them is that you have to have an idea of how you might go about preserving the site. Then you have to have some sites to work with. Then you have to have an education. In the case of irrigation, it was involved political efforts and an awareness of a nation to do something with rivers, and big time. We have a smaller problem in that we have very little prairie left, and very few people seem to know what a really genuine remnant prairie is. So how do we use some of these things as a parallel for what we might do in the future? And with these sorts of projects, you have to think not just here and now, not just with this administration, not with this present jurisdiction, but you have to think 200 years, 500 years. So there's a long-term interest. Well, let me review what we did last week, because it's fairly complex, but it's been fairly effective. A very interested statesman. In the future, he would be 3 times Prime Minister of Australia. But at the time, he was concerned that drought had made some areas to the west of New South Wales, Victoria, and South Australia drought-stricken. And what could we do about that? He also knew that down the east coast of Australia, there's a mountain range called the Great Divide. On the east of it, facing the Pacific Ocean, there's arable land that the range is not really all that high, but it's high enough to take wind-blown rain clouds up to the point where they precipitate. So you have a mountain with dots of volcanic material here and there that give some richness. And you have, in the past, an inland sea with soils underneath it that are very various. Some of them are excellent, some of them are sedimentary rocks that have been leached. So on this mountain range you have streams that flow quickly to the east and into the Pacific Ocean, so that water is kind of lost. The same mountains with snow melting provide water that goes to the west in a slower fashion, but it goes through mallee, scrubby land that no one would occupy except for with a few sheep, probably one sheep to the 30 acres. What might you be able to do with this? These rivers, there's one main one I'll talk about, which is the Murray River. There are two major other ones, Murrumbidgee and the Darling, and they all come to a point near to their outlet in South Australia. There's a final 500 miles that runs to the ocean. As with New Orleans, you have an abraded stream when that river hits the ocean. It's not the sort of place that you can put shipping through or have a harbor. It's lowland, but very prone to shifting sands and the like. So a politician, statesman, Alfred Deakin, looked at this and said, I think we can do something to irrigate. He didn't really know much about irrigation. There was not a lot of reading material. So he traveled around the world to see other irrigation sites. Irrigation is not new. It's way back to the Mesopotamia and other places where irrigation was in vogue. It also lost out to salting. Salting being where you put water through a desert, and the desert salts have risen to the surface, and they can cause damage to irrigation. So some experience here. In California, he found two brothers, Scottish in background, grown up in Canada. One was an engineer, George, and one was a horticulturalist. George was by far the oldest, and he had been working with shipping and a lot of engineering projects. In fact, he had a lot to do with the first electricity to Los Angeles. So Deakin approached these people because they had gone to a place called Ontario, named after the Canadian background, where George has looked at a mountain with snow on it and decided that he could buy desert land and irrigate, and it had been very successful. He was astute enough to not just look at irrigation, but to look at the sociology around it, the creation of towns, and the whole project had succeeded to the extent that it was nationally and internationally known. So the Australians, headed by Deakin and backed up by journalists and people of stature who liked the idea. So they approached the Chaffee brothers, and they were accorded a very good hearing, and the journalists behind this were supportive of Deakin in inviting them the two brothers to Australia to look at Australia's situation with drought and water, drought and flooding rain, drought and flooding rain. How do you handle these things? The Chaffee brothers weren't sure that they wanted to do that, but they did. They came and they looked, and they went to an area called Mildura, which was having its problems with sheep stations and drought and dying animals and low prices for sale of ground. And he noticed that one station had a very good garden, and it was doing well on the soils, and it was due to water. So George decided he could do something, and he invited his younger brother, who was a horticulturist, to join him. And they spend most of the rest of their lives working in this area of Mildura, which is on the Murray River. And this was before Australia federated, so that you had a federal government overriding 6 states, and so each state was somewhat individual, and this river serves 3 states. So George had to go to a somewhat new system where government was very powerful, and government was also quite able to argue about who got what order and where. So eventually he handled this and got permission to put in more or less a new town and thousands of acres of irrigation. And realizing that it was going to take between 3 and 7 years before some of these fruit trees and grapevines and vegetables were going to be able to mature. He was also aware that this Mildura was way out in the boondocks. It was serviced by paddle wheelers that it could come up the river when it was in flood stage. It was also serviced by a railroad line that was 100 or more miles away and would not be extended for many years because it was felt that the area between the terminus that was and the terminus that they wanted, there was no traffic in between. So the fruit that was about to come into action after a lot of work was going to have a trouble moving around the country and internationally. Went ahead. First of all, they looked for a billabong, and David found a nice example of a billabong. In the U.S., it's referred to as a cut-off meander or oxbow lake. And these oxbow lakes tend to dry up. When flood stage comes, they will fill in. So George Chaffee decided to put a pump on the stream and fill the meander with water. And then the stunt to irrigate is to pump that water uphill. So then you can run the water back down in a gravitational style. Those of us who have had to work on this sort of thing are used to it. When you decide to get water, and that might be controlled by local and regional and governmental interest. So the water on the hill will gently flow down, and you have to. So it's ditch irrigation, and you have a shovel and a sluice gate, and once you let the water out, you're there to let the tree get water. Then you block it off and let the next tree get water. So you're constantly moving mud to allow the water in. You have to have people who are willing to invest 7 years of their life. So then comes the advertisement of the idea. If you are going to save a prairie, it has to be well known. The counterpart in the irrigation system was to go to the old country. This was the empire. The sun never set on the British Empire. This was colonialism. And they created documents, and especially a red book, which detailed what the potential of this site was. And so they attracted a lot of English people, because that was the mother country, but also Europeans and entrepreneurs that were interested, and some people were just plain willing to try. And so once again, you have the publicity, but you then have to have a group of people who are very interested in getting together. And I see this happening here. I see it with the master gardener and the master naturalist, what he did with reading the landscape, the nature natural area study group, which, to remind you, will this week be going to the Kickapoo Trail, which is one of these things where you have a site like Mildura and you work with it to let people know what it is and work out the balance between recreation and preservation. And so somehow you have to have an educated population. The people that were coming to Mildura from England especially were often middle-class people who were prepared to do interesting things in colonial settings. It was very much encouraged in the colonial age, and England especially was producing people for development of overseas places, whether it was Portugal or France or Germany or Italy. The mother companies were moving around the world and utilizing the facilities. So how do we look at that locally? How do we gather up little pieces of nature that we want to preserve and let people know about it? For a long time, many of us did not want to advertise the 3 little cemeteries that gave us an idea of what 80 or 100 broadleaf species and the grasses were present. Cartographers would want to make maps, and we were not sure about that. And you go to meetings, and there were meetings that didn't take people to certain natural areas because they were interested in seed. And if you have 10 plants, then you don't really want to collect seed from that. So there was some secrecy about this. And you have to realize that it's 6 generations since people settled here and removed the prairie in order to create agricultural sites. They did a lot of drainage and got the water off, and Champaign County was the last county developed, mainly because of that swampiness and drainage. So go back to the irrigation area. They were successful, and way out in the boondocks. So by the time you got your grapes to Adelaide or Sydney or Melbourne, they were in bad shape because they were bullock trains or horse-drawn equipment, and so this was a problem. You had a thriving situation with no transportation. So last week I sort of gave you the idea that this was straightforward. It's not. And if you're going to deal with our own prairie situation, it's not. And it's going to take a lot of people to do a lot of things. The Grand Prairie Friends has gathered up some areas, but they have also morphed into forest preservation, which is easier to do because, well, in the first place, they were lucky enough to get some donations of land and interested people and enthusiasm. So they now have like 400 acres of forested land as well as prairie land. But therein is a group of people who do things. The Prairie State Conservation Coalition, initiated by Fran Harty, who was at the time regional director for the Department of Natural Resources in this general area, and he lives in this general area. So he has transferred to the Nature Conservancy and is a leader in putting together Prairie State Conservation Coalition, which we go to regularly, and that's probably 10 or 12 years old now, but it asks a lot of questions about natural history in this prairie state. Which was two-thirds prairie. And now, according to Jack White, who's a nabob in investigating the quality and value of remnant natural areas, wants to remind us that the state has formally preserved less than 0.01% of its formal original prairie. So it behooves us to look for plots that are not the best. They're the only. So the Grand Prairie Friends got a mile of prairie between Gifford and Penfield, which they still have. It's narrow. It's got farmland on either side. It's subject to weeds. It's subject to herbicide. But it was the start of Grand Prairie Friends being an organization that spoke for prairie. It's fortuitous that it can go off in different directions, but still is there, hanging in and reseeding territories so that there are buffer zones to protect things like the Loda Prairie or the Prospect Prairie or the little prairie that is at Rankin. And those three cemetery prairies are looked after by a range of people. Some of them are very specialized people. They're looking at a salamander or a particular plant. At Rankin, for instance, there was an attempt to put a buffer zone around the cemetery prairie, but it was planted heavily to grasses. So then people who knew about prairies found that the risk was that the buffer zone prairie would go into the remnant prairie and kind of destroy it. So that area was replanted, and the cemetery prairie is, with 80 species, is visited by people who know, but we have to get to the point where some of these places have to be available to people who don't know. That brings us back to what's left. Often what's left is along railroad lines, where the railroad law said you couldn't invade the territory. Often it is invaded, and the railroads don't always worry as long as the invaders behave themselves. And so even the railroad right-of-ways are disturbed. They're disturbed in the first place to put a railroad line through, but it's linear, and it doesn't disturb the 100 feet wide right-of-way. So we're going back to the irrigation situation. We have to have the general public know a little bit more about their heritage heritage ecology. And the railroad right-of-way beds have little pieces of prairie here and there. If there's an interurban, it makes it wider. If there's a road going in and it's 200 feet wide for the right-of-way, then you've got more space. So how can we gently develop these sites with, they often have grown invasive trees, and so the little pieces of prairie are there. They're according to a spectrum. If you go to Rantoul, for instance, you will have wetland in front of what used to be glacial moraine, a continental moraine, and on the top of the ridge, which is fairly gravelly and sandy because of rocks and rubble dropped out of a glacier. So you get this spectrum of wetland, the outwash plain, and you get a slope going up a gentle hill that you may not even recognize as you're doing that. And you have mesic plants that can need a little more water, but then on the top you get dry plants, and that sort of range of habitat is very helpful. Going back to the irrigation area, the publicity needed a red book, a catalog, a prospectus that let people know what they could do, and that probably cost quite a bit of money, because this was a very well delineated book. We need some of the same sort of thing here. We have Jeffords and Post, who are Natural History Survey people who have given people access to the 14 ecosystems that we have in Illinois, and say give people the opportunity to find trails and rails that give them access to the landscape. So actually Illinois on a national and an international level has been very good at putting together a natural history survey. A guy named Forbes got together and he put that survey into action. He had an idea, and it took off, and it's now a Prairie State Institute that does a lot of the fundamental work. But so you can ask someone to come and talk to you about snakes or specific plants. or about the soil, which is just loaded with bacteria and fungi and all sorts of things that don't exist in a field that has been herbicided. So you also have people who, like park districts and forest reserves, that are prepared to plant the prairies and simulate them. And some of the simulations are really very excellent and can give you an idea of what prairie was about. There's a Doris Westfield prairie in Vermilion County Conservation District where she and others went around and picked seed from these local plots and made it work. So back to what do we do next? And I'm thinking that we need an organization that may not necessarily own a lot of land, could do, but would be interested in the plight that if we want a new soybean to be perennial soybean that you harvest with a mower for 20 years, would reduce erosion and sending all that soil down into a dead zone in the Gulf. If we're going to do that, people need to know that that has to be balanced against 10 more rows of corn and soybeans that are going to bring instant money immediately, but in the long run, you're going to think 200 years, 500 years. You're thinking of climate change and how plants will adapt. And those people in the Natural History Survey are there churning out information about water, aquifers underneath instead of on top. And so the information is there, and we applaud those people who, like Jefferson Post, are producing books that are expensive but wonderful. Going back to the British situation, where this red book that they produced gave a lot of access and a lot of good reasons. So a lot of people that came to Mildura were of British stock, and they came, and the two Chaffies were of Scottish stock, and they got together as a community so that all these different agencies, many in Illinois, there's been about 10 attempts to get together all the natural history people. So you have a camaraderie. That hasn't exactly succeeded, but it's come a long, long way. Back to Mildura. Eventually there came to be a drought. And there also were other problems. The soils were salty, that you had to have troughs that carried the water. And if those troughs went along by a little rill or a creek, then you had to have something to support that trough. You had to have a aqueduct, or you had to have to make sure that the trough didn't leak. So they gradually were developing some of the problems. There were rabbits. There were locusts that ate just about everything between the two of them. But there were in there people who came to school teach but decided to investigate a particular plant and know its life history and how it could be avoided or utilized. And there were people who came in who looked at Greece and Europe and saw that the same plant was not yielding in the same manner as at Mildura. One vine, for instance, had very heavy bunches of grape that would get to the point of being almost ripe and then would drop to the ground and be wasted. And just somehow doing the research, they found that the Greeks and others knew to take a little scion, a little strip of bark from the grape, so that the if you know your botany, there's a phloem that takes water up to the plant, and if you deny the movement of too much water, then the plant will yield. It will yield lesser grapes, but they will stay in place, and overall the yield is better. But it takes someone to come from Greece and say, hey, we can do this. It may even be that that's a trade secret, and you have to infuse people to find out what is the secret. And there were things like frosts. At one stage they had a huge frost, and that will take out all your plants. And so the research there was that your problem is not making smoke. They used to think that smudge pots smoke over your areas would save the soul of the plants. But eventually a little bit of research, and they found it was mainly temperature. So if you got to 32 degrees and there was a frost in line, you got out with lit oil burners and increased the temperature just enough to preserve the plants. If it was locusts, you got out there and dug ditches into which millions of insects would fall and then be destroyed with, and I'm not quite sure how, but that was a community effort where everyone had to be out there, or even your cabbage would end up as a little stick. A lot of these sorts of things came together, and the rivers were still the major access, and that was the case in Illinois also. You could bring a small boat up the Mississippi, up the Illinois, up the Missouri, especially in flood time, and the river ran slow enough that you could, with some degree of energy, use that flooded period to work. Paddle wheelers went from having a rear paddle to having side paddles. So they could get on the Murray River, they could get from Adelaide to Albury, which is under that mountain that was providing the snow and runoff that was being put together. But railroads were coming, and eventually they would come. And that somewhat obsoleted the paddle wheels. And we have a parallel here, because just as the canals from New York to the west and the lakes, just as they were getting to their peak, the railroads came, and the railroads were more flexible, and that also happened in Australia. Not that the railroad was extended to Mildura. There was a lot of debate and discussion, and the George chap, he was rather disappointed that he'd gone from being recognized as an innovative soul to being a nabob that was a failure. So he went back to the U.S. and continued to work there. But his brother stayed and became a very respected citizen, and both their families remained. And that sort of history where you get families that are interested in doing things are essential to this sort of discussion. We have families that have 100-year-old farms and these sorts of things, and we need those people to help to preserve the genetic gene pool. Well, that wasn't the all of the irrigation system. World War I came, and that changed people from horses and oxen to early trucks. They were still around when I was young. They were like Leylands and the first trucks, and many of these trucks still had solid tires. So there was a lot of development, and then there was another depression, and then there was a humongous flood. And David put up a picture last week. The tree had on it a sign, "This is where the such and such flood was level 2." So they're used to it, but a lot of their houses were inundated, and there was the first attempt to put in a weir, and that started some of the first arguments about who got what water, because the people who were downstream from the weir didn't get any water. And that argument raged for a while, and eventually the drought was broken, the river flowed again, so it didn't ever come to a head, but it still comes to a head these days. Who takes out what water, and are there controls? And some people from the U.S. go to Australia and think that it's laissez-faire. But the Australians are rather clever at not producing more than they need to produce, because it is like they have to dump wheat or other products on the world market, and there's no price. So there are worldwide agreements, and Australians are into those, to make sure that they're not overproducing sultanas or underproducing something else. There is also biodiversity. These people got to be experimenting with gobs of different vegetables and trees and palm trees, and some would succeed. Some, like apples, would succeed very well, but then Tasmania was the major producer of apples, so that was their domain. So you don't step on other people's toes. So gradually you put weirs and locks, so that you create a pond of water, just like on the Mississippi, where there's something like 29 locks and weirs. You drive your paddle wheeler in at the bottom of one weir, and then you let water, block off the entrance and fill water, and the boat rises, and then it's on a different level. And if you do that every 50 miles, you can get traffic up the river. And each of these pools allows for a pump to pump water. And one of the major efforts was to put in a Hume reservoir. It's 3 times the size of Sydney Harbour, which is quite huge in its own right. This was a huge volume of water that could be apportioned out in regular intervals. This was no longer a flood stage for 6 months and then nothing. This was when the meltwater had finished melting, that was there. It still had some problems because some of these rivers, the tributaries, run right up into monsoonal territories. So sometimes you would have monsoonal water coming at the same time as melting snow, and that would create problems. So some of the subsidiary rivers started to put in weirs and also grow irrigation crops. And there were research stations that started to look at sticky details like letting salt water into old seabeds that were gravelly enough to accept the water. But some places they didn't have that. So some places the soil would get coagulated to the point where he couldn't get water to go into it. So they had to have ways of dealing with that, breaking that up. Then you got, after the recession in the 30s, there came to be World War II, and these people were very oriented to protecting the world. The Anzacs went to places like Gallipoli, and a lot of them lost their lives, including one Chaffee's son lost his life. The Mildura provided more people than most communities in Australia. So when those ex-soldiers came back, they were given properties and encouraged to expand this irrigation area so that for about 60 miles on either side of this river, there is irrigation, and it does well, and the people doing it, camaraderie and willing to help each other when different situations arise, like a disease or something like that. More recently, we have looked at those rivers that flow rapidly to the coast and provide a coastal plain for dairying and the like, or mixed agriculture. And a lot of water runs free into the Pacific. So the Snowy Mountain hydroelectric system dams some of that water that goes to the east. Not easy to dam because the fall from the mountain Great Divide is steep, so you have to have a very high dam to collect a little bit of water. And they channel that water through tunnels and allow it to drop into the Hume Reservoir and other reservoirs. And that produces electricity. So this is one of Australia's 7 wonders of the world, is the Snowy Mountain hydroelectric system. And it apportions out water, and there are agencies that are often controlled by the farmers to elicit rules and regulations about how much water you get and how often you can use it and what is needed. More recently, we've had a drought. Right now, I'm talking to my sister just last night. There's been a drought for perhaps 5 years. It's very much a drought that is affected by climate warming, where you get periodic bursts of rain and too much, and then nothing. So it's variability that's a problem, and some. So some of the rules and regulations that go with a regularity of climate are changing, and some people take advantage of that. They put their own pumps into the river, and there's an international move to buy land when it's in a disadvantaged situation, and then not always obey the rules. So once again, government has to come in and do something. So yes, there are swamplands, and swamplands are extremely important for the genetics. So in some cases, the swamplands around the river have been reconstructed. And you also have to know that when the settlers moved in, they replaced the Aboriginals. And so in some cases, they have been providing Aboriginal reserves where Aboriginals can do their own thing and tell people how they did live in this desert without water. And so coming back to Illinois, what do we do? I think we have to ask for enough money to make it possible to hire people who are managers, who know the details, people who are excellent at bringing people together, sociological people who know the how to work the sociology with the agriculture, so that you have nature and nurture working in lockstep. And I think one of the things we have to do is to go to the people and ask for their involvement. That means we have to be very good at teaching people what it is we want to do. If we want to take a plot of 9 acres at Rantoul and utilize an old Route 45, which parallels a new Route 45, which was going to be a dual highway, but is not a dual highway anymore because they put in 57 and that takes most of the traffic, then there's 10 miles there that is wider because it had an interurban, wider because it had a dual highway with only one part of us being used. How do we take on that? We need a certain amount of financial input to make it possible to have vehicles that can go to these places. We're at the moment talking about bulldozing some of the more ugly part of the Pope Prairie at Rantoul. That sort of thing costs. How do we exterminate a really scungy weed called teasel that is a very attractive ornament put in the cemetery nearby? The history is there, but the plant escapes. How do we look at wetland that we might be able to purchase to complete a transect up and over the hill? Can you bring people off the highway at Kankakee and say, okay, Kankakee has sand dunes that are a result of dried up glacial meltways, and there's an interest in that area. Can we encourage you to take the old Route 45 instead of 57 south and parallel to the railroad line? And can we have a kiosk here and there that will allow people to know that this is the heritage prairie that we have? It's more than corn and soybeans. Then you come to places like Loder and Paxton and Rankin, where there are real prairies that so small that they're not exactly typical. But this is what we have, and this, if you are a visitor coming to Illinois and you want to know about the heritage ecosystem, then this is it. And we need to save the buildings and the elevators and the history of what happened. At the moment, we can't take more than about 15 cars of grain from a wooden elevator. And the rail system, which is very good, would prefer to take more like 125 cars. Then you have super elevators, and so things are changing, and things will always change. How do we introduce people to these changes, and how do we retain a little bit of the history in the act? So 4 minutes. You got the message to some extent. But every step involves a thought. When you go over the Route 45 to Paxton and invite bicycles to use the old concrete road, you have to know that you have to have a bridge that goes over a outwash Plain Creek that runs in front of the Paxton Marine. So there lies a few $1,000s, perhaps $1 million, to put in a bridge, just to get that far. There's Ludlow, which was at one stage the terminus for Illinois Central. There's a little history there, and can you introduce people to that? We'd like you to be out there. Go over to Bloomington and run the trail. That is recently the tracks have been taken up and it's abandoned, and the abandonment has been very neatly a few feet wide, probably not more than 25 at the most. But if we have to have an association of American highway and transportation engineers size trail on that corridor, we're going to lose a large percentage of the only prairie we have left. So it behooves some of you to get over there and have a look at that trail and figure out how you could talk to the state, how you could talk to the federal government that has a rail banking act and can put this sort of corridor into an interim use so that railroads could come back, where if they were going to buy a corridor back in years between Bloomington and Champaign in years to come, then it would almost be impossible because of the challenge of coming through properties. So there's a rail banking act, and Kickapoo Trail is on that rail banking act. It's getting from the federal government $12 million, mainly because it is preserving a railroad bed that could come back into action. It's not likely to come back into action quickly because the railroads are doing very effective work with their main lines, not so much these little lines that went out to service small communities in a day when you brought your grain in by horse and cart. So I think that's probably about as much as we can say. But there are these sites around between Whiteheath and Seymour, between Monticello and Cisco, and on into Decatur, that we cherish for their value, for their gene pool, that we may not know what we want for a disease we have in 200 years' time that we don't know about, and we need a biochemical out of that gene pool. And we need to be able to allow people to come in from the rest of the world and also share that gene pool. It's not just ours, it's a world resource. So this is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
And Dave on the board. And as always, the views and opinions expressed are solely those of the speakers and no one else.